This is Duke University.
I think of Latino not as a subject position, that is not as an identity. No one in the 19th century, very few people would have identified as Latino in the 19th century. Instead, I think of Latino as epistemological. That is, I'm interested in theorizing the way communities in the US, communities of Spanish Americans in the US, have tried to grapple with that transition in becoming part of the US, especially for those who were in the Southwest, but also was the case in Florida and the East Coast as well. So we now know that the modern category of the literary in the Atlantic world only began to emerge and consolidate in the 18th century. For example, in writing about early American literature, Lars Ziff has theorized this historical transformation of the emergence of the literary as being one of a movement from immanence to representation. And so these are two key theoretical words that I'll be unpacking here through Lars Ziff's work. According to Ziff, early Anglo-American writing through the late 18th century understood itself as being a transparent form of representation, as something that was foundational, that was immutable, related to truth, and provided a sense of what Derrida describes as the metaphysics of being. That is, it was directly a representation of one's soul. But this shifted in the late 18th century, and it shifted to this idea that language, that we as humans are products of language, that there is no fixed essence, and that we could use language to create and construct our sense of who we are. Embedded in this notion of the literary was writing as a search for immanence and belonging, for what Derrida described as that sense of presence, where writing increasingly becomes a means of approximating a sense of the divine. Rather than merely reflecting God's fixed meaning, language comes to be seen as a self-reflexive, flexible tool of understanding our world. Writing became seen as fluid, malleable. Writing in print came to be seen as a means to create and construct one's reality, rather than merely reflect it. This shift from immanence to representation, from the idea that one spoke or wrote from an immutable, fixed sense of self to one where, quote, there is no assumed real self that is being represented, end quote, provided some of the infrastructure that would allow novels and fiction to flourish. For Hispanics, the modern world came crashing in upon them in 1808. In May of that year, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and deposed the Spanish king. Overnight, the Hispanic world was transformed forever. Throughout the Hispanic world, Spaniards, Spanish Americans, and Filipinos, including those living in what is today the United States, sought ways to buttress transcendental truth. If an unquestioned Catholicism and monarchical rule had been the basis for organizing their world for over 300 years, what would replace authority in the absence of the king and possibly God? This question is what I argue is what most of 19th century Latino writing grapples with. 19th century Latinos write so that they can imagine new worlds that would replace monarchical rule. 19th century Latino writing then operated as part of a larger and largely undifferentiated field of writing, one that included written documents such as manuscripts and epistolary forms of all kinds, as well as revolutionary pamphlets and broadsheets, political journalism, memoirs, and histories. Each of these, and their vast diversity, sought to sustain a sense of immanence, of belonging in the world. Writing and publishing becomes an increasingly important way for communities to search for new sources of metaphysical certainty. Not just political, obviously, of course, political certainty, but also a sense of belonging, of being, a sense of security and knowing who they are and where they came from. They produce, that is, through their writing, a self-sustaining knowledge that becomes ontologically foundational. What emerges from the archive of Latino writing is a yearning for new modes of being, a grasping for language that would allow these individuals to practice new personhoods, to enact new ways of imagining community, even as they use language long available to them within their Catholic Hispanic tradition. Here I'd like to move into the second part of my talk, and paid closer attention to this journal to see how this young woman used writing as a way to find meaning in her life, to find a sense of presence, immanence, and transcendence. In 1850s Texas, Latinos were coming to terms with the reality that they were being displaced by the newly arrived Anglo-Americans. Latinos published newspapers beginning in the 1850s. They held elected political positions, and they used these positions as a way to mitigate the virulent racism that was quickly enveloping them. What they were experiencing were the beginning forms of colonization, one where the elite would be displaced and the socioeconomic diversity of Latinos would be erased, reducing most of them to an impoverished community by the end of the 19th century. But in the midst of all this social turmoil that was redefining the future of Latinos in Texas, the first school for young girls opened in San Antonio in 1851. And San Antonio at this time was the largest city in Texas. Catholic nuns opened the Ursuline Academy in 1851. Within months, the nuns found themselves overwhelmed with families, Tejano, French, German, and Anglo-American families, all desiring to enroll their daughters in the school. Students were packed like sardines, according to one contemporary, in the 4 large classrooms on the first floor, while those from throughout Texas and northern Mexico who required room and board filled the sleeping quarters on the second floor to capacity. Among their students was 15-year-old Florencia LEAL. It's not clear when she enrolled, but she was studying at the academy by 1853. Her notebook served her several purposes. She had decided to learn the art of writing letters, and she transcribed in perfect penmanship and with beautifully decorative bullet points a Spanish language epistolary manual. The manual covered every detail from style, quote unquote, how to address and begin a letter, end quote, to rhetorical devices such as prolepsis, analogy, metaphor, etc., to the appropriate tone to use when writing to superiors. Florencia spends the first 23 pages studiously learning the art of the written word. El estilo es la manera de pintar sus pensamientos y sus sentimientos con palabras pronunciadas o escritas que son como los colores del estilo. Style is a manner by which one paints one's thoughts and feelings with spoken or written words, which are like the colors of style. Her manual describes 3 styles, of which the sublime, for example, pinta los grandes pensamientos y los sentimientos elevados de una manera noble. The sublime paints grand thoughts and elevated feelings in a noble manner, end quote. And she will put these to test. Later, she will diagram her sentences by writing the sentence 1 word at a time down the left side of the page and defining the grammatical function of each word on the right. The diagramming lesson concludes, quote, con saber analizar todas esas palabras se pueden analizar todas las demás. By knowing how to analyze all of these words, one can then analyze all the rest, end quote. But in learning how to express herself through language by studying epistolary styles and grammar, she too comes to use language to paint her own thoughts and feelings. She's able to use these skills in order to structure and analyze her interiority through language. Her journal, through her writing, her sketches, comes to be one of the ways that Florencia begins to unfold her subjectivity. Florencia's journal is a stark aberration for the mass of documents that I found in my more than 10 years of archival research. The vast majority of those, if not all, were meant to be heard or read out loud by many, if not by a large public, then by a coterie of political administrators or elite. Florencia, on the other hand, did not intend for anyone else to read her notebook other than those to whom she addressed her letters. It is intimate, private, an expressive lesson in cultivating one's sense of self. Florencia had little to say about the events that were unfolding in San Antonio during the chaotic years of after the end of the 1846-48 U.S.-Mexico War and the increasing racialization of Mexicans. And historians have documented very well the sheer brutal violence that was occurring in Texas at this time. And she never said one word about that. Instead, she dedicates a space to ensuring that her friendships will continue to deepen, to studying Spanish grammar, learning English, and transcribing images from her mind's eye. Literary scholars, myself included, have long focused on those established genres that I mentioned before, right? The novel, the poetry, short fiction, drama, and other belletristic genres. But if literary history has fetishized these final forms, It has done so at the expense of the vast archive of writing that surrounded, and continues to surround the development of these genres. As the 19th century continued to unfold, Latino writing sought to reconfigure political morality in a world that became increasingly hard to comprehend. For these writers, a world of certainty became a world of ambiguity. The previous Catholic vision of self and society as a beautifully woven tapestry was torn to shreds before their very eyes. And these writers slowly became aware that even those shreds that remained would have to be redesigned in order to remain integral to the now dominant liberal capitalist world of the United States. In the sovereign space that had once been dominated by God and King, humans will now use their own words as the foundation of a new world. Florencia Leal's notebook should serve as a precaution. Though her writing is an exception, it also serves to remind us that the official archives housed in libraries, even if long ignored, also need to be read against the grain. Any kind of written text produced by those ostensibly outside the workings of political power, such as women, peons, and indigenous peoples, were usually of no consequence to those who produced and organized archives. It has been in part the literary categories of genres that has made it difficult to historicize 19th century Latino writing. Rather than only search for the final form of the novel, it would serve Latino literary and intellectual history better to historicize the intertwining development of writing and that search for presence.